Would anyone like to call out some of what you heard or share what you thought of? Just call it out. Connections. Balance. All of us. The reason I asked this question is a number of years ago I worked with the biggest chemical manufacturing plant in the world that had major safety issues, and they were trying to break through them by dealing with policy and procedure, structures, new laws, new regulations, ways of training people, and they still couldn't break the nut on it. And ultimately, the leadership team started asking a question: what was the source of safety? And it turned out not to be, for them, policy and procedure, rules and regulations, the safety manual, which is the history of human tragedy in any organization, right? They make a rule to fix something. I'm doing some work in patient safety. I'm sure there's a manual on patient safety somewhere, which is actually the catalog of everything that went wrong in the past, but doesn't predict what will go wrong in the future, right? So they answered this question: what's the source of safety? Caring. A male-dominated engineering culture in the foothills of West Virginia in the United States, and that's what they came up with. And that over time allowed them to include more and more and more people until ultimately they had opened the doors to the community and became very well known as the safest manufacturing facility in the world. But it was that shift. And I asked that question because one of the things that really attracted me here today when Anne-Marie called was the name. 1,000 Conversations for a Healthy City. It suggests actually underneath that is an idea that actually conversation, the simple act of humans sitting in circles, having a conversation, can bring about change. And I actually believe that and have a fair amount of experience doing it that way, though it gets more complex. So however you answer this question about what's the source of health or what's the source of a healthy community, that's going to drive your actions in this. And it's going to have something to do with how you design, how you think about where this process goes. So, put this down. It's not working. I'm putting this, you've seen this phrase before, culture eats strategy. It tends to ring true with people. Why does it ring true with people? Well, all the marvelous things that the speakers before talked about are only taken up by a social system. And a social system has an identity, or in most cases, very fragmented identities. And everything that comes into it is interpreted through that identity, right? So I make sense out of the world based on who it is I think I am. What really matters to me? What's critical to me? So culture comes in, so the culture will take up anything that's given to it and turn it into itself. And that's one of the core reasons that change is so difficult to do in a predictable way. And many of us sitting in this room are highly involved in doing things like setting up new structures, new policies, new procedures. But all of those things are, again, taken up by a system and turned into something else. It eats all these things, but I just wanted to show you one cultural response to health. Can you see this up there? Anyone know what this is? This is the map of what has come to be known, is the Affordable Care Act in the United States, come to be known as Obamacare. This is the map about how it works. So, what is that map about? Anyone? Huh? Who's in the center here? You know, who drew this map? It's about the identity of that core center here. And it's also about a series of policies, procedures, ways of navigating a particular system, which may or may not contribute to health, certainly contributes to lowering the acceleration of the cost of health care, which is one of the goals of Obamacare, right? So so far it seems to be doing that. There's no indication yet that it's actually about healthiness, right? By the way, anyone see patients on this chart? It's way over, see it down there? That's smaller. Did I just hit?
You hit the black one.
Blacked out. What did I hit? Oh, magic. Anyway, the patient is way down in the lower, as you're looking at it, lower right corner. It's smaller. The patients are smaller than the Internal Revenue Service, the tax authority. So I think that part of this, the idea of conversations being able to change how we are together, what we do together, the kinds of outcomes we get, that what we're really trying to do is to create the capacity for people to do for themselves most of what's been done to them, right? And I want to give you an example that's really far afield, I guess. I have worked for, it is a conversation-driven organization, and I have worked with and become friends with an organization in Venezuela called Seco Si Sola. It is a cooperative, but when I say that word, you think you understand the structure of it. It is not like any cooperative you know. It has no ownership, no leadership, no structures, no hierarchy. It has a lot of things it does, and it runs itself by conversations. So we're doing 1,000 conversations for a healthy city. Seco Si Sola tracks their conversations. They run about 3,000 a year within the confines of the cooperative. They look like that. One of the things that, the history of Seco Si Sola is that it began, let me step back. People do understand that Venezuela is in profound chaos. In fact, the depths of the chaos of Venezuela, we hardly know because this is opinion. We don't tell the full story because they have the largest oil reserves on Earth. We don't want to offend them any more than we have, right? So we don't get the whole thing. But last time I was in Venezuela, it was a kidnapping attempt on my life. Very common thing. The #1 target for murder in the murder capital of the world right now are security guards, because they have jobs and they're defending people like me when they're over there. It's a very, very challenged environment. It's broke. You can't get food in the stores. The state stores are open 3 days a week. They sell, I'm not exaggerating, toothpaste, toilet paper, and diapers. And people line up for those. Most things are happening on the black market. Seco Si Sola, however, would be an organization a place that you would want to live. It began 45 years ago as an urban setting funeral cooperative, because the urban poor didn't have the ability to, didn't have the funds to do proper burials for their people. That's where it began. Today it's 20,000 people. It is the largest agricultural producer in Venezuela. It's the largest retail sector of, and I think I have a picture of one of their many food markets. They feed the central part of Venezuela. They're the prime, and by the way, things are stocked. There is food there. They do well. They now have 6 health centers. They have, last year or 2 years ago, they opened a 20-bed acute care hospital. They have the largest acupuncture school in South America. They've been able to do all of this simply by paying, there's the hospital, close attention to what's coming up in them, right? And being in conversation all the time. And a couple of examples of this. One is they constantly are re-looking at their history, how they became who they are, and who are they right now, right? That's, how did they become who they are? And one of the telling moments in the history was 30 years ago they had taken over is the wrong word, they began providing public transportation in the second largest city in Venezuela, Barquisimeto. They were doing it for free, and then they were doing it for donations. Over time, they built a whole network that was a very effective public transportation system and really helpful for the city, and they became the most trusted, sort of like the NHS in England, they became the most trusted entity in Venezuela. The political government at that time saw them as a threat because they were so trusted and shut them down and threw their leaders in jail, which sparked a nationwide protest, and the leaders were let go. That event actually began to change that system because they started talking about how did we get into a position that we were seen as the enemy, that we were in a confrontational situation. And they arrived at something about that the work that they were doing in the transportation system wasn't what they were about. They were about each other and how to help each other into lives worth living that were healthy, productive, socially powerful. And that's what they've done. So that's the Seco Si Sola is an extraordinary place, and they do it by sitting down in conversation all the time and paying attention. In those food fairs, we're showing you here, those are open 3 days a week, and on the fourth day they sit down and talk. And they sit in circles outdoors on miserable chairs for as long as you possibly can imagine, and no one's unhappy about it. They love it. I mean, it's a way of life. And those conversations, as I said, they have no agenda, but people sit down and they talk about what matters to them. And it's about what matters to me as a person, what's going on in my life. People talk about the struggles of their family in the city. They'll talk about what went on in the food fair, and inevitably they'll start talking about, the way that John, the way that you behaved last week in the food fair, it looked like you were pretending to be our boss. Do you think you're better than we are? And those kinds of conversations constantly go on, make sense of the world. And they also do the technical pieces, right? How do you run this place? How do you account for it? In an environment that is just terrible violence and theft and whatnot, these food fairs, which run cash drawers everywhere, have 1% shrinkage. That's in a retail term. If you don't know that, it's how much loss there is. Tesco probably has 8%. So in a very, very difficult environment, it's different. And it has to do with the way in which people are connected. That was one of the sources. They're connected around meaning and identity. So one way of thinking about how to run 1,000 conversations is the way in which we have to design and control them. Someone said, organizations, cities, communities, they're living systems, they're not machines. This way of thinking about the world, which infects everything we do, right? We're always thinking about how do you control, how do you manage, how do you define. This is a philosophy. It's not just an organization chart or organogram. And the philosophy in it includes a theory of information, right? Anyone know the theory of information in this? All right, 1,000 conversations will need a little nurturing.
This is the person at the top knows everything.
The person at the top knows everything? Yeah, it probably doesn't actually imply that, but it implies that we know who needs what information at what time, and we can get it to them, right? I'll tell you what you need to know when I think you need to know it. How's that going? Does that work? No. So this is the Myron Rogers organization chart. I'd be happy to come in and re-engineer your organization so it looks like this, and the fees are low. This is actually from an old client. It's the Emerging Regional Integrated Delivery Systems Networks. A partial explanation of cooperation and competition in the system or something like that. It's partial. But which one of these feels more like real life, right? This one or that? How does real work get done? How does real community get formed? It's actually in this network of things. The problem is we're often imposing that first chart, that philosophy, the mechanical philosophy, on how living systems connect with one another. Living systems connect with one another through meaning, right? Identity is all about meaning. So we pay attention to what's really important, what's meaningful to us. And we look for others who share those views or can enhance those views and connect with me. One of the downside of this is that people look for evidence to confirm people. Let me say this differently. I look for evidence that confirms who I am, what I believe, my intent in the world, right? And so do organizations, so do communities, So do any group of people who've developed an identity. We look for the proof that this identity is right. In a rule of living systems is that when you only look for that information, you will die. You're actually, the seeking is for information that disconfirms, that begins to shake up your current view of the world, the limited view of the world that you have. And how you generate conversations that allow in greater and greater information for that disturbance. You can never actually direct another living system. You can only disturb it. So the provocation this morning is really about that. You know, how do you disturb? What are the disturbances that are needed in the system? This, as I said before, this is where most change efforts lie, right? If we want to fix something, as I said, doing some work in patient safety, somewhere someone's cooking up some new set of policies and procedures that will be handed over to people to implement, and that will go along with the 45 other initiatives that are currently underway for anybody who's working in the health system. And, you know, I mean, these things are very hard. There's the issue of best practice, for instance. Why is it that best practice doesn't transfer, right? Why is it that, you know, evidence-based practice, for instance, you know, the evidence on evidence-based practice is that people don't practice by evidence. They do what they do. We do what we do, right? And we look for evidence that says, oh, no, this is right. And so there's a whole issue about how you change that. How do you change the nature of the dialogue, the conversation, move it away from here? For me, this is where everything happens in a system. And let's call this city, this community, these communities within the city, a system. It is all about identity. And that identity, here's the interesting thing about identity. Identity is what you do, what we do, not what we say about what we do. So on an organizational level, you can say the mission and vision and values statement in any organization, that's what people say we are. But in fact, that's not true. It's not true for any organization. It's not a critique. It's just a mythology, right? I could give you my description of who I am and what motivates me and what my values are. But actually, if you want to see who I am, watch what I do. Watch how I interact with people, how do I treat my family, how do I make decisions, whatever it is. That'll tell you what I truly value. So there's the identity piece. And changing identity is tough, right? Here's two things from living systems theory. One is a living system will seek to preserve its identity, right? So every time we try to change and we get pushback, we see that pushback as resistance. And so John resists me, he does all the time. John resists me in some way because we're trying to move in a particular dimension and we're in an organization together. He now is seen as trouble and we send him to HR for counseling, right? But he used to be a star in the organization. We just changed the rules somehow. It's a new structure, it's a new way. We've provoked him into resistance and now labeled him as someone who should be out there, when in fact he's just being a human being. This is a normal thing. There's nothing malicious in it. Preserve my identity, what I'm valued for, how I see myself valued. Excuse me. The other rule in living systems is a living system will change in its identity in order to preserve it. And as individuals, we really know this well, right? We know it because we've gone through changes. If I look at myself 20 years ago, I'm not the same person, though of course I am. There's a continuum there. Ideally, though, at this point in my life, when something I've never seen before happens to me, I can deal with it in a productive way or in a way that holds the integrity of who I really am. But 25 years ago, I probably had a 50-50 chance of making the right decision, right? I'm probably making less mistakes now about violating myself. Organizationally, however, we get frozen in the organization chart, in the static piece of it. So right now, thinking about 1,000 conversations contributing to health, there are institutional identities. This city is, on one level, really together as a city, and there's a core identity of it, and on another level, it's profoundly fragmented. And one of the fragmentations happens around role-based identity or institutional identity, which supersedes what it is we're trying to do together for the whole. And there's an imbalance where, my role as a chief exec of acute care hospital, I'm trying to preserve that acute care hospital at all costs, make it effective, whatever else. And that will often trump my ability to work across silos. And we live in a time when there is no individual, no expertise, no profession, no organization, no single organization is capable of dealing with the complexity of the issues in front of us. It actually requires a shift, a dynamic shift in balance from the role-based piece to the whole-based piece. The role identity to the whole identity. That's the shift. They both matter, but the shift to the whole matters a lot. And the 1,000 Conversations is certainly something that could help in that. Time to wrap up. We'll skip that one. This is, some of the other things that are out there is that a living system preserves its pattern of organization, its network of relationships. When I think about health in the community, one of the things I know is that many of the people who need to be in the conversation are not in this room. And they don't get into these rooms very often, right? And that the conversation on the street corner in East London, the part that is not yet rebuilt, or as Anne-Marie was saying, that part of East London, those conversations on the street keep people healthy or unhealthy. The meaning, the social, we do know that the social network modulates behavior, keeps it in a container. It has its own identity and its own force. People know the concept of emergence, right? They've heard this a lot, it gets talked a lot, living systems theory. It's really quite profound. It says essentially that whenever any social system develops, there's a connection between people, that above that social system will arise a kind of capacity, a way of dealing with the world and seeing it. Once that arises, it's a function of the system, not of the individuals in it. So you have a very complex issue, and it's very sticky. It's very hard to change. That's why culture persists through time and space, right? Yeah, anyway, good. Next. Here's some of Myron's maxims for change in systems. They're all really simple. People own what they help create, full stop. That is one of the beauties of this concept of 1,000 Conversations, is that it is a creative act, that you get people together around questions that really matter for them and for the larger system, and something good will come out of it. And people will own it themselves. That real change happens in real work. It doesn't actually happen in this room. It's actually what you do on the streets, in your life, in your job, every day with your family. Those who do the work do the change. So one of the dangers in talking about healthy city stuff is that there would be a select, if you will, or maybe even elite group of us who would figure out how to get there and impose that on the system as a whole. There's a bigger challenge about how you engage the intelligence that's everywhere in this community and how you bring it as a peer equally into the relationship, beyond roles, just as people. The other one is start anywhere but follow it everywhere. There's enormous controversy about where do you start a process like this. It has to, some people say at the top, some people say at the bottom, some people say, in Asia. I don't know, or in the pharmaceutical company, or it's in big data, or whatever else it is. It actually doesn't matter critically. You need something that's significant, right? But it doesn't have to be enormous. And you start down the path knowing that stuff is going to show up that's going to direct you to the next piece of change that you have to do. It's going to say, pay attention over here. You're going to provoke some identity issue that's going to look like resistance. And the question is really, what's the identity that this is surfacing, and how do you actually enter into that in order to change it? And the other thing I would say is start anywhere, and you have the responsibility to follow it everywhere. Because if you ignore stuff that comes up in the process, it will come back to haunt you in some way. And then the core thing, 1,000 conversations, I can actually see unleashing on the streets, each one of us going out and starting conversations. That's great. And there needs to be some way to connect the system to more of itself. So as those conversations are moving around the system, how do you connect them back together? So I think that's it.
Thank you.